Wouldn't it be nice to have several thought leaders in your industry know and love your brand? Start a podcast. Invite your industry's thought leaders to be guests on your show, and start reaping the benefits of having a network full of industry influencers. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show.
Before we get into today's episode, we wanted to let you know about another podcast you may want to check out, the Sales Podcast with Wes Schaefer. Wes, who's known as the Sales Whisperer, helps salespeople everywhere generate more inbound sales that close faster, easier, at higher margins, with less stress and more fun. Our favorite episode on his show is titled, Why You Need to Build for the Next Recession. Check it out and find the Sales Podcast wherever you do your podcast listening. All right, let's get into the show. Welcome back to B2B Growth. I'm Logan Lyles with Sweetfish Media. Today is another episode in our Why Podcast Work series, where we're talking to B2B marketers that are seeing results with podcasting for their brand. Today, I'm joined by Jenn Dellwo. She is the marketing manager over at Revel Health. She is also the producer and host of Radio Revel. Jenn, welcome to the show. How's it going today?
Great. Thanks so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. I know that you have had some passion for podcasting for quite some time. You guys are working on season 2 of your podcast, and I've enjoyed being on the sidelines, kind of seeing your own podcasting journey. For those listeners who aren't as familiar with yourself, with Revel Health and your show, give us a little bit of context before we dive into chatting a little bit about what your podcasting journey's been like today.
Sure. So I started working for Revel back in April of 2018. So it's been about 2 years now, and started as the marketing manager here. We were doing a lot of content marketing and trade shows, and I was brought on to really kind of take it to the next level and bring new ideas. So a little bit about Revel. It's a next-gen healthcare technology company that uses behavioral research and data science to move people to take action for better health. So basically what that means is we work with health plans and healthcare organizations to engage their members to do things like go and get a flu shot, or go in for a cancer screening, or fill out a health risk assessment. And we started Radio Rev as one of those new initiatives, a new way to connect with people once I was brought on to move forward with the content marketing.
Awesome. I love it. It's a really nice segue, Jenn, into the first question I wanted to ask you, and we've asked a lot of marketers here on this series, is tell us a little bit about your journey into podcasting before we jump into what it's like today, some of the benefits, some of the surprises, those sorts of things we'll definitely get into. But I'm always interested in kind of that journey before you decide to do a podcast for your B2B brand, before you start releasing episodes. What were some of the things that caused you guys to decide, yeah, we're going to do a podcast for our brand?
Yeah. So to answer your question, I need to back up a little bit, because there were 3 specific things that kind of all happened at the exact same time that unequivocally pointed us in the direction of starting the podcast. And as these things came together, there ended up being very little doubt in my mind that that's what we needed to do once all of these things started happening concurrently. So the first thing that happened was all of a sudden we had been getting quite a few requests for our leadership team to be guests on other podcasts to talk about a lot of different things, including, but not always, healthcare innovation or topics about technology. And that's what really kicked off the idea and got us thinking, if people are coming to us and wanting our team to be guests on their shows, it means that people are really interested in what we have to say and what we're doing. And personally, it showed me that we're showing up in the industry as an authority. So what's stopping us from leveraging this type of feedback into establishing our own show? So that was really the first piece of it. And the second thing, I had just attended Inbound, which is HubSpot's annual marketing conference. And I attended a session that was all about repurposing content using various campaign sources and channels. And it was about how to build a really effective content blueprint and the power of creating new content out of existing pieces. And which really isn't a new concept in marketing at all. But one of the things that stood out to me was the presenter's insistence that all companies should have a podcast. He said, as a channel, marketing teams should be leveraging it to build awareness and get your name out there in a different way that not as many B2B companies are using. And he just kept saying, be innovative and get a step ahead. And that really stuck with me because that's really what Revel's all about and what our marketing team does a lot of. We love to test and learn and experiment to see what resonates and what doesn't. So after that conference, I'm on the plane home and my wheels are turning. I'm thinking, people are wanting us to be guests on their shows. This guy at Inbound is telling me that this is the next big thing to get into. And the last thing, the third piece, is I had just launched the month before a podcast with my husband. And this podcast that I do with him was just a for fun thing that we wanted to try out. We've always wanted to have a creative outlet to share. And podcasting felt like a fun thing to do with a low barrier to entry. So because of this personal interest, I realized I know all the equipment that's needed to do this. I know how to produce and edit. I know what it takes to get it off the ground. So why can't I do this for Revel? And so now I've convinced myself that this needs to happen.
I love it. I can remember tuning in to at least one episode of your personal podcast where you guys were breaking down or ranking your favorite songs on the Broadway musical Hamilton, right?
Yes. Yeah. I got very emotional in that episode because I'm so passionate about it.
Hey, it's easy to get passionate about that show and the music in it. That a conversation for another episode, perhaps, though. I love that. And, you touched on something there, kind of the double benefit of, podcasting's consistently on the rise. But I've talked with folks about, well, even if you aren't convinced that podcasting is on the rise for your niche audience, it still helps you create that more efficient content engine. And, marketing teams that we're talking to, whether they're 50 or 500, are trying to be more effective with their content creation, putting it in front of the right people, getting it contextual for different channels. And so I think it's really interesting that you caught on to that really early. As we keep talking about kind of your early days in podcasting for Revel Health, Jenn, tell us a little bit about some of your initial aims. Once that kind of clicked, seemed like at least 3 stars aligned, and we're going to do this. Tell us a little bit about the next steps there in kind of setting out your initial aims for your podcast.
Sure. So the initial aim really was to create more awareness about who Revel is, build a reputation as an authority, and provide really great stories of innovation and inspiration within healthcare that makes our audience look at Revel and think, this is a company I trust. They're sharing cool stories about change makers, and they're doing really great work that is making a difference. And so overall, my goal for the show was to be, it still is my goal, is to be relatable, to be interesting, to be different, and to be human. And I want the show to be less about throwing facts around and more about storytelling. And I think one of the biggest challenges was when we as a company decided that, yes, we're going to do this. There were definitely some people internally that were still skeptical right out the gate, which is completely understandable. You don't get names and people specifically raising their hand for this type of content. It's ungated, it's passively consumed. So how do we really track and gain leads from this? Which I think is a totally fair thing to ask. And my response to that is good marketing uses a multi-channel approach, something that the Revel platform does as well. It's a good mix of gated and ungated content. And that's how you can really hook people and draw people in to learn more. And that's something we've known for a long time in marketing. And a podcast is really just another avenue to do that.
I love that. I would love to kind of stay on that track for just a second, Jenn, because, I talk to a lot of marketers who are thinking about a podcast or a podcast series on one of our shows as thought leadership for their brand. And I see them wrestling with, how much do we invest in brand and thought leadership, which is very top of the funnel. And, they're being measured oftentimes on how much pipeline are we generating, how many leads. And so oftentimes drawing that straight line is kind of where people wrestle. What are some of the ways that you guys have seen those two are connected, or you kind of came to terms with where the podcast would influence your overall sales funnel and how you would measure that going forward, or how you would go about helping it influence other pieces that are maybe further down the funnel.
Yeah, I think a big piece of it was just establishing that this is a brand building exercise. This is to help our sales team, give them another tool to connect with people, to share with prospects, to give people an idea of what's going on in the industry, and to kind of help with that. But where the leads are coming from question, we tried to come up with a way for the sales team to be happy at the same time. So some of our episodes within the show notes link out to downloadable content that you can only get from the podcast episode. So if someone downloads that, then they specifically do raise their hand and we know that they've listened to the show in order to get to that content. So that's kind of how we came to a happy ground between sales and marketing.
Yeah, I really like that. I've seen some folks try to completely gate the podcast content, which I think is a move in the wrong direction. Back to your point of you need a mix of gated and ungated content. And part of the reason that podcasting is growing is that it is ungated. There's a very friction-free way to get content, and then it becomes about the quality. Can you create content that draws people in? And isn't that what we've been about since the inbound movement has been pushing us as marketers is that, it's this law of attraction, right? And so the fact that I can't just capture your email and then send you to Spam Island, that shouldn't be a drawback to podcasting. That should be just encourage us to make better content and then use that in a way with demand gen efforts that make a lot of sense. I like the way that you guys are doing that, not gating the podcast content, but maybe gating some content that the podcast points to so that you can have that thought leadership, brand awareness, and those demand gen strategies feed off one another.
Exactly.
Hey everybody, Logan with Sweetfish here. If you've been listening to the show for a while, you know we're big proponents of putting out original, organic content on LinkedIn. But one thing that's always been a struggle for a team like ours is to easily track the reach of that LinkedIn content. That's why I was really excited when I heard about Shield the other day from a connection on, you guessed it, LinkedIn. Since our team started using Shield, I've loved how it's let us easily track and analyze the performance of our LinkedIn content without having to manually log it ourselves. It automatically creates reports and generates some dashboards that are incredibly useful to see things like what content's been performing the best and what days of the week are we getting the most engagement and our average views per post. I'd highly suggest you guys check out this tool if you're putting out content on LinkedIn. And if you're not, you should be. It's been a game changer for us. If you go to shieldapp.ai and check out the 10-day free trial, you can even use our promo code B2B Growth to get a 25% discount. Again, that's shieldapp.ai, and that promo code is B2B Growth. All one word. All right, let's get back to the show.
So you mentioned actually enabling the sales team. That's a common theme I've heard in this series with marketing teams. So often I'm hearing people encourage us as marketers to utilize the voice of the customer. And I hear people telling salespeople, you need to add value. But oftentimes, that voice of the customer kind of comes in these polished case studies that people aren't trusting as much because they know we've kind of force-fed that quote maybe, or wrote it and then asked the customer for their approval. And then sales, we're not giving them an easy way to supply any sort of social proof or thought leadership content to their prospects. Can you tell us a little bit about how you guys have taken it, put it into the sales team's hands and seen them use it, in prospecting, in nurturing, and in different things in their typical sales motions?
Yeah, happy to. I think this is probably one of the biggest benefits of starting the podcast because, as you mentioned, it's just another tool that our sales team can use. So instead of sending a long white paper to a prospect or asking someone to log on at a specific time for a webinar that they have to sit down and watch, people can listen to our show on the go and learn more about who Revel is and the work that the work that we're doing. And it's not like a direct sales tool. We're not talking about our products, but we're interviewing our listeners' peers. So they're hearing from other people in their same position about the different things that they're doing and solving the same problems that our listeners have. So people will come back to the sales team after listening to it, say, I get it. Like, I get what you guys are doing and I want in on this. So they're using it as an easy tool to get people to hear more about what Revel is doing without being super salesy and getting in your face and saying, here's a product demo. It's more about the story aspect of what we're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just so much more scalable, right? Putting those stories of your prospects' peers into the hands of your sales team so that if they're talking to someone who fits this persona, okay, I've got an episode to draw from that Jen and the team on the marketing team, have already done. And I can kind of match those two as well. We've talked about pushing to gated content. We've talked about the podcast itself serving as sales enablement. Obviously, when you look at kind of your podcast metrics, a lot of folks are looking at, downloads and just seeing, okay, is that kind of trending up and to the right? What are some of the ways that you guys have continually measured success or progress with your podcast, Jen, especially as you mentioned in the early days, wrestling with, is this the right move for us? Is this the right channel for us to invest in?
Sure. So we do look at a few different metrics. The key one, obviously, is how many times has the episode been listened to or downloaded. And as I mentioned, we do have some gated content attached to the podcast. So those pieces that are directly driven from the podcast itself, so we can measure the impact that way. But I think the number one thing for us is really just feedback from our audience, because our team is using the podcast as a sales tool and are encouraging prospects to listen to it. They'll come back to us and let us know what they think, if they have topics for ideas and other guests, or if they want to be a guest. We've definitely connected with people that way. And we really saw the impact of this just recently when we announced we were looking for speakers for our upcoming season. We ended up getting an overwhelming response from people with ideas and topics and feedback about how much they're enjoying the existing episodes, which feels really great for me, because it was basically unsolicited feedback. I was looking for speakers, but instead I got feedback, which was great.
I love that. So tell us a little bit, Jen, about, maybe something that's been surprising for you guys. Most marketing teams that I talk to, again, from marketing teams of 5 to 500, podcasting is usually a brand new channel for them. And so I think there's this kind of trepidation about the unknown. And since you guys are a little bit further along than maybe some folks listening to this, Jen, I would love for you to share a little bit about, maybe something or a few things that have been surprising to you along the way. And then we'll get to kind of some final parting thoughts on your advice for other folks that are at that stage in the journey as well.
In the beginning, for me, there was definitely a fear about finding guests. Like, does anyone even want to be a part of this? And it ended up being so much easier than I was anticipating. People were really excited about being asked to be on the show, which is really fun because they brought a lot of great energy, and all of the interviews are so thoughtful, and people are really putting time and energy into these interviews, and their passion for their work really shines through, I think. And now that we've been doing this for over a year, I found that our episodes are really complementary to the rest of our marketing efforts. While they may stand alone a bit as far as our content, they fit into the general themes that we're shooting for. And I think what's nice about that is that we're able to repurpose the podcast episodes into more content. So we can write blog posts about them, or they can inform our ebooks, or we can use them to promote our upcoming events. So there have just been so many surprises about how, yes, we added this other channel that seemed like it might be a heavy lift, but it's actually made our job a lot easier to create additional content.
I love that. And I'm really interested too that you were surprised by the high percentage of folks that you invited to be guests, said guests. You didn't have the friction there that you thought, especially in an industry like healthcare, because we've produced shows for folks that are reaching the HR audience or manufacturing or sales, marketing, you name it. And we've seen kind of different trepidation there about, can we get guests based on, kind of our guest persona? And to me, I would think, healthcare is probably one of those tougher ones, but you guys were pleasantly surprised, right?
Yeah. And I think the reason I was fearful was because I didn't know how guarded people would be about the innovative projects that they're working on. How much do they actually want to share? Because maybe those are things that they don't want other people knowing that they're doing. And so it was great to find out that they were willing to share, because it's for the good of the whole industry, which was a fun thing to discover.
Yeah. Do you have any advice for folks? I know we want to close with some parting advice for folks on kind of planning out their podcast in the early days. But since you guys have seen a lot of success in getting the guests on your podcast that you've wanted to have, any advice for folks in outreach strategies or the way that they do their messaging to those potential guests?
What has worked well for me is if there's a guest that we know we want to have on, I will find someone within the organization that knows that person best and have that person reach out first and make the connection to me if they're interested. So I'm not just some random person reaching out to them, asking them to be on the podcast. It's the salesperson or maybe our CEO or the head of our government programs initiatives. Like, she will get me in touch with the right person so that it's a more friendly and, welcoming space. So they have an introduction before in advance.
Yeah, that's really solid advice. Well, Jenn, as we wrap up today, as we typically do on this series, I want to give you the opportunity to offer some advice to folks, B2B marketers that are maybe thinking about podcasting, or they are, a little bit behind you in this journey of podcasting for their brand. Since you've been kind of thinking through why we should do it, how we're going to do it, you guys have been through a year of podcasting for your company now. What advice would you give for folks that are kind of standing at that point today?
I think my number one piece of advice, because we went through this, and I'm thinking if we had just thought through it a little bit more in the beginning, it wouldn't have been as tricky for us. But I would say have a standard episode format. When we first started, we hadn't decided on a host and we jumped around and tested out different people hosting. And that could have been tough for our audience to follow. So fast forward to now, we figured out what works and we have one person hosting in an interview type of style. But if I could go back, I would have worked that out earlier and experimented before those episodes went live. And the other piece of that is, I think having a standard episode format too is really important. So music in the beginning, music at the end, and ask maybe one or two of the same questions every time that are a little bit more fun to get to know your guest. We ask the same two questions of each person that's on. We ask, what's your favorite 80s song in the beginning of the interview? And we end the interview with, what's the coolest thing you've done lately? We get some really fun answers. And I think it just continues to humanize the guests and adds a personal touch that you might not normally get with this type of interview.
Yeah, absolutely. We've been doing some thinking on that. A lot of the shows that we produce, we have a consistent, find a 5 to 7 second snippet that's kind of that cold open hook that maybe you put before that standard intro, those sorts of things. I've seen other folks do this really well. Ethan Butte, who hosts the Customer Experience podcast, opens with a standard question, closes with some standard questions. That familiarity kind of gets listeners into a rhythm and expectation. Another thing along those lines, I'll just add, because I think you're touching on some really good points for folks to think about, Jenn, is, can you have a standard closing line that, again, is just kind of that mental hook? I think of Sangram Vajre at Terminus and, his saying that he repeats a lot, that without a community, you're simply a commodity. Or Craig Groeschel on his leadership podcast, people would always rather follow a leader who's always real than always right. I think I butchered it just a little bit, but it's sticking in my head enough to where I can almost recite it verbatim. But those sorts of things I think can be powerful. So think about them in the early days and set yourself up for success. Well, Jenn, this has been a fantastic conversation. I've known that you've had, passion for this channel for quite some time. And so it was a pleasure to chat with you on the Why Podcast Work series and have you be able to share some advice and some specific examples of what your experience has been like podcasting for your company. So if anybody listening to this would like to stay connected with you, a fellow marketer or someone thinking about podcasting for their brand that may want to ask some follow-up questions, or they want to find your show because maybe they're in the healthcare space and they would like to find Radio Rev, what's the best way for them to reach out and stay connected with you and your team?
They can find me on LinkedIn, and it's Jenn with 2 N's.
Awesome. And the show is available everywhere podcasts are consumed, I'm assuming?
Yep.
Awesome. Well, Jenn, we will make sure to link to your show in the show notes. This has been a really great conversation. Thank you so much for getting on the other side of the mic as a guest today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I hate it when podcasts incessantly ask their listeners for reviews, but I get why they do it, because reviews are enormously helpful when you're trying to grow a podcast audience. So here's what we decided to do. If you leave a review for B2B Growth in Apple Podcasts and email me a screenshot of the review to james@sweetfishmedia.com, I'll send you a signed copy of my new book, Content-Based Networking, How to Instantly Connect with Anyone You Want to Know. We get a review, you get a free book. We both win.